Hello, students. Welcome back to Understanding Christian Marriage. Glad that you are continuing on in this course and look forward to our continued learning process. And again, as I mentioned in last week's lecture, if you have any questions about the content that I cover, either covered last week or cover this week, feel free to reach out to me. I want you to stay on task. Uh, don't allow any kind of confusion or questions about what's expected of you uh, to hinder your progress in the course. And this will be a very helpful experience for you as you continue on in this course. As shown in the syllabus, we continue on in the Harley book, and it is a book devoted, as you're quite aware, to husbands and wives and the overall view of marriage. We are talking particularly from a Christian point of view. The William Harley book is a good book. It is one, obviously, that I've chosen for the course. As I mentioned last week, it is a little heavy on the topic of basically the avoiding an affair. And while that's definitely something that I would agree with, and it's good for us all to avoid, I want us to remember that more positively, what we're saying is how to have a healthy marriage, not simply how to avoid affairs, which is obviously, again, a very good idea, very godly idea. It is not the focus of the course. And I wanted to say that again because as you read the next couple chapters, as you have hopefully already done for this week, you realize that he spends quite a bit of time talking about that. But the reason he does that is primarily because in these next couple chapters, he has this great way of explaining the major needs of women and men. And as we talked about last week, some of these are generalizations. However, their generalizations are such because, in general, this is how reality plays out. So, in the context of what he is writing about, he says that affection is the number one need of most women, and sexual experience with their mate, from a Christian standpoint, with their spouse, is the number one need for men. Now, again, that varies, but from the point of the author, uh, he is stating these are the biggest needs. And as he says repeatedly in those two chapters, you can't really have one without the other. You read the story about the woman that wasn't receiving affection from her husband. And the reason she wasn't receiving affection is he didn't know how to give appropriate affection other than through sexuality. And this was frustrating to her. And this led her to develop an unhealthy and ungodly relationship with a fellow coworker, which led to an affair. That's an example with which Harley starts it out this chapter dealing with the issue of, and the important issue of affection. He says there in that chapter on affection, beginning on page 36, he references throughout there some very helpful tools, if you will, to show affection. But before we get there, I want to make sure you understand there in the middle of page 38, it says, to most women, affection symbolizes security, protection, comfort, and approval, vitally important commodities in their eyes. When a husband shows his wife affection, he sends the following messages: I'll take care of you and protect you. You're important to me, and I don't want anything to happen to you. I'm concerned about the problems you face, and I'm with you. I think you've done a good job, and I'm proud of you. And he goes on to talk about things such as hugs and holding hands and walks. Now, as he says, some men know how to do this well, and some struggle with this. His point being that those that struggle with some of these concepts need to improve on them, need to see the importance of doing such things. He goes on page 40 and 41 to talk about such things that any man can learn to be affectionate. It says on page 41, And then you should ask her to help you learn to express this affection, which you already feel, in ways she will appreciate. And on 42, he goes into quite some detail on ways in which to show affection from morning till night, as he spells out the day for people that are looking for that advice. In the next chapter after that, he goes into the specific discussion of sexuality. Before we go there, I want to point out a sentence that's on page 44. On page 44, the author says, affection is the environment of the marriage, while sex is an event. Think of the environment and the event. We are in the midst of football season. I'm sure you're quite aware of that, whether you're a football fan or not. You have people looking forward to the college playoff game, for the college championship game. People are watching the final teams of the NFL play. In fact, there's one going on right now as I teach. I believe it's not over yet, and there are games coming up where people are going to be glued to the TV, as we might say, or glued to their smart device and watching these games where these men gather and play an event. The event is the sport of football, the one of which we're speaking. The environment, however, is the stadium. It's the smell of the stadium. I mean, the positive smells, the popcorn, the hot dogs, the aromas of cotton candy or whatever else is there. You have the companionship of people around you, many in the same jersey color, sometimes people with the exact opposite jersey sitting next to each other and friendly jives along the way saying that my team's going to win or my team's going to win. And there's the noise of the crowd. There's those that are cheering on the team and the crowd. You have the music. You have the national anthem. You have all of this going on. It's this great big environment. And it's a friendly environment unless it gets out of hand. But we're going to go positive here. And there's this friendly environment. The fun starts on the way to the game, and people are excited to go there. And they get to the parking lot, and they're running to their seats and getting excited about what's coming up. And then the game begins, and the intensity rises, and there are good plays and not such good plays, but the event is taking place. I use that illustration to talk about what Harley's talking about, that you can have an event that misses out without the environment. So when he's talking about intimacy, sexual intimacy, the act of sex itself is, relatively speaking, not a difficult act. There can be challenges, medical difficulties, emotional difficulties, etc. It can be misused. But it is one that can be used beautifully so as God intended it. And we'll go back to Genesis here to look at that here in just a moment. But it can be used in a beautiful way as God intended it. And it is best used within an environment of joy, an environment of celebration. So while sex involves, when done in a godly way, just two people, a man and a woman who are married, there is this feeling of the crowd. Think of you think of the football crowd, the stimulation, to use it in a neutral term here so far. The stimulation of the crowd. We're getting excited. The music's going. We're ready for the team. That's a form of just this excitement level rising. Now take that to an intimate level in a couple, and you have this excitement rising. It is buying the flowers. It is buying the dinner. It is planning the date. This is the driving to the ballpark, getting ready for the game. It's putting on the uniform. It's putting on the perfume. It's taking the shower. It's getting in your clothes ready for the day, looking your finest. These prepping for the event. Now, life is not about sex and life is not about football, no matter what some people may tell you. But these are special events, and God has taken human sexuality and made it not only something to continue the human race, but to help husbands and wives to develop a very deep relationship. And therefore, as husbands and wives engage in this beautiful, symbolic, and physical action, as he's saying, there needs to be an environment in which the event takes place. And the environment is one of safety and of love and of understanding and of honesty. And one of the things that helps us to understand how this whole thing started, how God intended this, is back in the very first book of Scripture, Genesis, in the fourth chapter. We have Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, two accounts of the creation, that God has created everything in a very powerful way and a hands-on way. And Genesis 1 tells the story of him speaking things into being, and in Genesis 2, this telling of it from a hands-on way, one showing the power and the magnitude of God, and one showing the intimacy of God, the willingness of this almighty creator, the almighty creator, to engage himself in his creation. And everything is good. There's no shame. There's man, there's woman, there's Adam, there's Eve, there's man in God's image, there's woman in God's image. There is Adam, mankind. Out of mankind, you have Adam and you have Eve, the mother of the people. And we see something tragically take place in the third chapter, the entry of sin into humanity. There's sin already present, because as we gather later from later writings in the Scripture, that there's some kind of heavenly falling, that the tempter, the liar, later we know him as Satan, has already sinned against God. But at that point in history, whenever that may have been, you have the man and the woman who are without sin and therefore without shame. But the one who has sinned, the being known as Satan later, has sinned. And he introduces the opportunity to sin to Eve and also to Adam. And Eve and then next Adam fall for the lie. They embrace the idea of becoming more than they're meant to be, and to somehow take upon themselves what only belongs to God, and sin enters the world. It's not until the next chapter, Genesis chapter 4, that we're first introduced to the joining of male and female. In Genesis 2, it says, leave his father and mother and you be united to his wife and become one flesh. This is reflecting forward, if you will, if there's such a thing. That is why man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. So the Genesis story is telling this historical account. Bones and flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman, for she is taken out of man. Then the writer of Genesis places this sentence in there in the middle of the story and says, in essence, by the way, because of how this took place, this is why man leaves his father and mother and he's united to his wife and they become one flesh. So historically speaking, the author is talking about something in the past and he's explaining why those actions still take place today. So while Genesis 2 gives some indication of the sexual relation to man and woman becoming one flesh, that is a reflection back. But then in Genesis 4, you actually see a description of this intimacy. In chapter 4, verse 1, it says this: Adam made love to his wife, Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. Gave birth to Cain. Adam made love to his wife, Eve. There is the most clear statement and the first statement in the Scripture of the sexual relationship between man and woman. And notice the verbiage as translated into English here is Adam made love. It doesn't say Adam had sex. It says Adam had made love. And I think that's very important to realize that this is in chapter 4, even though chapter 4 is after chapter 3. Now, that seems quite obvious if we know our basic number system. But what I mean by that is chapter 4 has this beautiful description of the unity between a husband and a wife, while Genesis 3 talks about the entrance of sin into the world because of this husband and this wife. And it shows the beauty here as we look at that truth that even though the first reference of actual sex between husband and wife takes place after the entrance of sin into the human race, here we see that they're still able to enjoy this in a way that honors God. Because one of the first commands, as we see back in the early stages of Genesis, is that they are to multiply. Back in Genesis 1, God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it." Now, he's talked about trees and vegetation in other places. He's not talking about trees here. He's saying you need to be fruitful. In fact, the word in Hebrew that we would understand now to be the male sperm, the word is seed. And so you think of anybody familiar with planting and gardening, et cetera, you have a seed that is planted, and from that seed in the rich soil grows this beautiful plant, this tree, this vine, whatever. And these early authors were saying there's a great way to describe this, that there is this beauty of the way God designed human sexuality, that a seed, not a literal seed, but symbolic seed, is planted and then helps this beautiful creation take place. In this case, she says, Eve does, in chapter 4, verse 1, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. And then later she gave birth to her son, Abel. So we have this word, made love. That word there is a beautiful word, which literally is yada. Yada. Now you're going to hear that word if you're in other ministry classes, you study some Hebrew, the Old Testament words. The yada is to know. It means to know, to respect deeply, but it also means to lay with. So while this is a word to know, it means to intimately know. That can mean just a close friendship or even a relationship with God. I know God. God knows me. But the Hebrew people have taken this word and used it in a beautiful way to indicate that sexual union is a great knowledge. It is a knowing of the person, a complete vulnerability, a complete exposure, which is why, when used inappropriately, it is more harmful in many ways than a physical blow to the person, because there is this vulnerability. There is this reference back to earlier Genesis, the two become one. There is this mysterious union, as Paul will talk about later in the New Testament. And so when used beautifully and as God designed, there is a wonderful way in which human sexuality is used. And so we're going to talk about that today. First, what I want to do is to, again, go back to the heart of the book and talk a little bit about the next chapter. And then we're going to go through some scriptures and talk about how those relate to the subject at hand, the affection and the sexuality. Remember, you cannot have one without the other. I'm quite sure all of you have heard the ancient question, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? And it seems obvious dealing with the creation account that the chicken comes first. But regardless of your thoughts on this, there had to be a chicken before an egg, obviously. But I'll use that saying for this purpose. A chicken, in order to be another chicken, has to be an egg. And has to be an egg in order to be a chicken. The two go hand in hand. So does it really matter which came first, chicken or egg? Did God put an egg here first or a chicken here first? That's not the important part of the question. The important part of the question is to consider that both are necessary. Both are necessary. Not only are both necessary in the act of sex, but both are necessary in the preparation for an environment where sex takes place. And by both, in this case, I mean both the affection and the sexuality. That there needs to be a strong, trusting environment of affection, both through words and through deeds. If in the process of reading the five love languages, already have read love languages, the premise behind that book is that everybody has a love language that speaks most loudly to them. And this is a way to show affection. So for a person who's spiritual or whose love language is gifts, then that person receiving a gift feels affection, feels that affection is given toward them and is more likely to be affectionate back. The same with words of affection, quality time, physical touch, acts of service. All of these things are very important and are ways to help affection grow within a relationship of marriage. In the chapter that follows on sexuality, which is chapter 4, page 48 of the His Needs, Her Needs book, it says the first thing he can't do without. He's going to speak in bold statements, as we'll see in a little bit in the book of Corinthians. It is possible for men and women, but to go with his statement here, it is possible for men to go without sex. And in fact, many would argue that there are a few, not many, but there are a few with the gift of celibacy that they feel called to that. And as we'll see, Paul, one of the greatest authors of the New Testament and followers of Jesus, himself was a celibate man. He had that gift, and he, in fact, encourages others to pursue that because he believed that you could focus more exclusively on following Jesus and serving Jesus if you weren't concerned with pleasing your spouse. He's not anti-marriage. He's not even anti-sex. He would be anti-sex outside of marriage, and he would be discouraging people not to get married and therefore not have sex so they can focus on Christ. But he also says it's good to get married. And we'll get to that here in a minute. But what I want to make sure we acknowledge, again, even though I picked this book, is that's an overstatement. It's an overreach. But I think it's a worthy overreach because what he's trying to communicate is this is a huge need. And when it is not met, it often leads to problems. When those problems occur, the man involved in those problems is not free of guilt or free of responsibility. That being said, that door being open to that temptation, to that difficulty, can be opened more widely when the sexual fulfillment is not taking place. On the bottom of page 49, he talks about an assumption that many husbands make, perhaps most husbands make. And he says, Harley does, that when men go into marriage, they assume that since they are committing themselves to one woman and one woman alone, that there is this stated or unstated expectation that this woman, his wife, will meet his sexual needs. The sentence says he trusts her to be sexually available to him whenever he needs to make love and to meet all his sexual needs, just as she trusts him to meet her emotional needs. Now, the words whenever he needs to, again, might be an overstatement, but there is a real truth to that just as women get married and say, I trust that this person is going to be affectionate to me. I trust that this man is going to be the one who cares for me and cherishes me. The husband says, I trust this woman is the one that's going to make sure that my sexual needs are met. We don't want to view marriage as I go for my needs being met and my wife goes for her needs being met. It needs to be both are aware of each other's needs and are mutually helping with this. And that is why it is so important for there to be clear communication. The The way in which he goes on in the chapter is he it gives some a little bit of a biological explanation of some stages of sexual intimacy or sexual experience. And I encourage you to read those. Encourage you to study up on them if you'd like some further information. There's a lot of great books out there. There's an old one out there called The Art of Marriage. It's been around for many years, and it is in a tasteful way a very good, detailed description of human anatomy, both for male and female. But what our author does here is he just goes into the four stages of the sexual experience. He talks about the arousal, the plateau, the climax, and the recovery. The way in which he describes those is brief but helpful. And the reason it's helpful in the context in which he's speaking is it ties together the affection and the act of the sexual experience. The arousal is predominantly speaking not difficult for men, um, except with the exception of times in life, whether it be medical or age related, where it becomes more difficult. But at least mentally, still, it's often easier, and physically, most often, much easier. And the woman normally will take more time in arousal. And he makes the argument that even women can make that choice, whether it be aroused or not, whereas men have more difficulty even making that choice. It's somewhat just happens regardless, and not just the young teenagers, but the men pretty much throughout their lives, as long as that is a possibility physically. What is good to notice, particularly when it talks about the first stage of arousal, is that is a scale that some, as I've just mentioned, will achieve that quickly, and some it'll take a long time. And therefore, he goes into understand that husbands and wives need to understand each other so that there won't be such a sexual frustration regarding these four stages. What I'd encourage you to do if you're married is to look to page 61 and answer these questions as a couple, where it says questions for her, questions for him to consider together. And I think that those are very helpful questions to have a conversation with your spouse about. What he is going to do is to make sure that we know that there are differences in male and female, and not just physically, but the way they respond to the invitation to sexuality, to the preparation for sexuality, to all of the above. I do want to add something here that's very important, and it really kind of bust a myth out there. Now, generally speaking, and therefore, as I said a minute ago, that when we say generally speaking, it is generally the case, which is why we say that. And overwhelmingly, the men have a quicker response sexually than do women, because that's the case. In other words, men can become aroused much easier and be interested in sex much easier, as far as going from not even thinking about it to full climax. People have assumed that all men desire it more than women. That is not always true. In a marriage, there can be a wife who desires sexuality or sexual experience with her husband more so than the husband. And that shouldn't be something that's thought of as weird by her, that she has too much of a desire or him that he has too little. It's just a good awareness to have that for whatever reason, God created us overall with men and women having different desires. And sometimes those are not as would be the norm. What is usually the norm is that men can respond physically much more quickly, but the desire for so can vary. So if you're a man and your desire is lower than your wife, don't feel less manly. And if your wife and your desire surpasses that of your husband's, don't think something wrong with him or something's wrong with you. Just continue to have that conversation. In the Balswick book that I mentioned last week, that I'll be referencing some as we go through this course together, he mentions, or they mention, the idea of the covenant marriage. We talked a little bit about that it's not simply a human promise, but it's a covenant, as in, I will do my part, even if you don't do your part. There is this to use the other resource I mentioned, the grace-based marriage idea, grace marriage. Well, this covenant marriage has some components that make it so. And one of them they talk about, is the secure sex. You have, in their words, secure love, secure sex, and secure relationship. With secure love, they're talking about those passages we think of, 1 Corinthians 13, which says, love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it's not proud, it's not self-seeking, it's not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. That is Paul's description to the Christian in Corinth of love, which is love across the church body. But we can take those verses and use them correctly, not out of context, but still use them correctly in reference to one person to another, which is the closest love. We have our love with our God is first, and then love a spouse would be the second most important love in our life. And therefore, while 1 Corinthians 13 can relate to those within the church as brothers and sisters in Christ, and beyond that, even one of the first ways we can apply those verses as well is to the relationship of marriage. And then secure relationship is this idea of we're on the same page. We're going to help each other out. And the other one that I mentioned is this secure sex. To help us understand this and what they were talking about in their book, the Baldwins were talking about, is found in the book of Song of Songs. And I'll go to the 4th chapter and begin in the 16th verse. It says, awake, north wind, and come, south wind, blow on my garden, and its fragrance may spread everywhere. Let my beloved come into his garden and taste its choice fruits. So this is the woman speaking. And the man responds, I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. I've gathered my myrrh with my spice. I've eaten my honeycomb and my honey. I've drunk my wine and my milk. And then the friends rejoice and say, eat, friends, and drink your fill of love. So there is this very trusting invitation that the woman gives, which shows that she feels that she's secure. Now, there's this beautiful symbolic language that, for those that don't like romantic literature, can actually even cause some embarrassment or discomfort. But she is actually not talking about gardens and about fruit in the sense of the green thumb. She's talking about her own body. And she says, awake, north wind, and come, south wind, blow on my garden, that its fragrance may spread everywhere. Let my beloved come into his garden and taste its choice fruits. Modern translation, not to be crude, but it's the take me. It's here I am, my groom, come and enjoy my body. This is what the bride is saying. And the husband is saying, now I've come into my garden. And notice he says my. In other words, she has been so secure and safe that she says, now my body belongs to you. And he's recognizing that. Now, you need to understand Hebrew culture here. He says, my sister, my bride. That sister, all joking aside, is not his biological sister or even a stepsister. That sister is just a word of endearment. And then my bride is this, obviously, statement that they're married. And then he talks about what he has done. I gathered his myrrh and his spice, and he has enjoyed it. And he's prepared himself and is going to enjoy her fruit. And it's a beautiful relationship sexually, to the point that it's not like they're onlooking, but they're aware. And they say, eat, friends, and drink your fill of love. In other words, enjoy each other. And this is really kind of as a side note here, what healthy family and healthy wedding friends are saying when they're supporting the couple as they get married is not simply go enjoy your honeymoon, although that's part of it, but recognizing here's a man and a woman that are saying we love each other and we should rejoice in the fact, not only for ourselves when we're married, but for other couples when we see that they have a healthy relationship emotionally, spiritually, physically, sexually, that this should be something where we can all say, eat, my friends, and enjoy the fruit, enjoy what God has given you. As I said last week, there has been far too much embarrassment around this subject within the Christian culture, even to the point of people pretending that the Bible didn't even mention the word. There's two things that the Bible talks about quite often, more often than many people are comfortable with, and you'd think that would be sin. Of course, that's one of them. But two, that's one other issue brought up quite a bit. Um, but two that are brought up over and over and over and over again are the concept of money and sex. Money and sex, money and sex. The Bible's talking about those, are referencing those in some way throughout the text. And we all know those are two areas through which great things can be done. Great things, literally, life can be brought into being, and metaphorically, life can be brought into being. So you have a benevolent, wonderful, generous person who has worked diligently and made a large income, and they turn around and give much money to help those in poverty, or help build a church, or to uh, help scriptures being translated in other languages so people can read the story of Jesus. We see this money being used in a great way, and the Bible says that's how it should be used. We think of the Lydia, who find in Acts, is this rich young businesswoman, and the first one of the first churches meets in her home. So she used her wealth wisely. It talks about the women who funded Jesus's ministry. They had larger incomes and were able to support Jesus in his ministry. So wealth is not a bad thing. It's how we handle it. Sex are the same thing. Throughout the scriptures, you see the misuse of sexuality, but then you also see these moments of the beautiful use of sexuality within the text. I mentioned Paul earlier, and his whole conversation about sexuality, and I want to talk to you about it, because what it's going to do is help us not only get a picture of what Paul was suggesting for others, but what we gather from the words he says within them. And this is in the first letter to the Corinthians. It is in chapter 7. So he's introduced the people to the gospel. He's talking about different issues. He's dealing with the misuse of sexuality in chapter 5 and incestual relationships. He's talking about sexual morality in the latter part of chapter 6, because people are misusing their bodies. He says in chapter 6, verse 18, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins about a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. We could say against the other person as well. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. And from this, he launches into this understanding of marriage and sexuality. And he says, quoting an unknown source here, he says, first of all, now for the matters you wrote about. So he's quoting the Corinthians, and the Corinthians, there's no question mark here, but it seems as if they're saying this and asking if it's correct. Quote, is it good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman? So that's a question. Now, to set some historical context, you have the people of Corinth are surrounded by a perverted view of sexuality. You have temples to goddesses, where many people believe that your crops would be blessed if you slept with a temple prostitute, where sexuality is rampant. Corinth is, you think of some of the most lavishly evil and depraved societies in our world today. That was Corinth in the first century. And Paul here is saying to them, I'm going to answer your question, even though there's no question mark. Again, we believe that they would have stated this and then later said, is, quote, is it good for man? It is good for man not to have sexual relations with a woman, right? We're just is correct. We're not quite sure. And this was a well sexed community, if you will. So this would have been a shocking statement. Uh, I think it's important for us to remember, as I believe I mentioned last week, that Paul's answer is predicated on the idea that Paul assumed Jesus was returning soon, and there was a lot to be done. There was a gospel to be spread, and it still needs to be spread, but it was very much in its infant stages, not the gospel itself, but the spread of it in that time period. And Paul thought, well, if we're going to get this accomplished, more so if we stay single. But keep hearing him. He says, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. Notice it doesn't say man with woman and woman with a man. It says a man with his wife and the woman with her husband. So this again, this reminder, it needs to be a married relationship. It's not authority for her own body, but it goes to the husband the same way. Do not deprive each other except for perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourself to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. And then he goes talking to the single adults, unmarried, widows, widowers, etc. But here, on the verses in which we focus, notice he says there's a duty here. And interestingly, he first reminds the husband that it's his duty. Now, most husbands don't think of sexually satisfying their wives as a duty, but there could be a reference here to remember that it's your wife that you should be fulfilling. It's not just you, nor should it ever be another person, particularly in the culture in which they live. But then he says the wife, also the husband. And then there's this really interesting thing that we might skip over if we don't know the cultural context, particularly in a world in which, thankfully, we've made some advancements, not everywhere, and unfortunately, a long way to go, where sometimes there's just been this subservient view of women. Certainly, and as Ephesians says, we are to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, and there's this mutual submission idea. So there's submission. Submission is not a bad thing. What's bad is when we say that there has to be some inferiority. Now, why I bring that up is in verse 4, it says, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. Nearly everyone who heard that or read that in the first century would have said, okay, that's nothing new there. Some might have said amen. The wives who heard that may have not rejoiced in hearing it, but they're okay, but my mom told me, that's what the rabbi tells me. That makes sense to us. That would have been the normal, and therefore not a surprising statement that this wife's body is not her own. It belongs to her husband. Now, many people would expect it to stop there because even in cultures today, sometimes there's this view that as long as the husband gets what he wants, then everything's kosher. But this is not what Paul says. He writes about the already cultural understood concept that the wife's body is not her own. But then he continues on, inspired by the Holy Spirit. And he says, in the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. So while generally speaking, the husband is not going to complain when a wife wants to engage in sex with her husband, there are times when a husband either has a lower drive or if he's been misbehaving himself, as Harley points out, there can be some disunity in the family. And here it says, husbands, remember, culture you're taught, your wife belongs to you. But that's right, but only part right. Right. You belong to her as well. And then he says, don't deprive each other. Now, why is this important? Let's go back to the question they ask, which is, again, not in question form, but we assume it's a question. Because in quotations, he's saying that they said it is good for a man to not have sexual relations with a woman. And Paul disagrees with that. he says, well, yes, it's good not to be married if you can help it. But if you are married, remember that you both belong to each other. Now, that's important because we realize that in that day you would have had wives who have discovered following Christ and thought this is a beautiful thing for me to do, and therefore I need to exclusively focus on following Christ. And you had husbands who listened to a friend, heard the town rabbi who's now a follower of Christ say, you need to follow Christ. And he would follow Christ. He'd stop going to the temple, the pagan temples, and he'd give his life to Christ. And you can imagine this man who perhaps has used sex as an act of worship in the pagan temples. And now he realizes that he's misused sex so much. And now he's following Jesus. He said, well, let's just do away with sex now because that has drawn me so far away. And now I've seen the truth. You can imagine these ideas going on. And so a husband might say, well, I know we're married, but I'm going to focus on Jesus, and vice versa. And Paul says, no, you need to enjoy one another. Then he does go on and say, but there's a time, mutual understanding, which you go for perhaps, he says, in other words, not required, but perhaps for an extended period of prayer. He doesn't say extended, but we assume that because he says, do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time. We're not given a time frame. But what they're doing is devote themselves to prayer. Some of you are familiar, if not all of you, with the idea of prayer and fasting. And often fasting is not eating. There could be a reference here to the fasting from sex as well. Well, just as the not eating of food for a short or more extended period of time can be a very healthy spiritual practice, if food is not taken at some point, sickness sets in, if not even death. I think there's a parallel here. He's saying that you can fast from sex within your marriage, but don't wait too long, because one thing he points out, Satan can get a foothold, as we read in the Arla book, that what those footholds look like and the ultimate potential crisis that comes out of that. But he says that there has to be this mutual understanding so that when they fast from sex, that they come back together so that the marriage does not become sick and the marriage does not die. He uses these illustrations quite well, and they communicate. In these verses, it is clear in verses 3 through 5 primarily, what he's saying, it is good for a husband and wife to engage in the act of sex in a mutual fulfilling manner, recognizing that while their body is feeling pleasure, their body is not their own. It first of all belongs to God, and then it belongs to their spouse. Now, that's an important factor in this as well, beyond even the idea of sex, because when a couple is married, there is this two becoming one. And so how I treat my body is reflected upon my wife. So if I am lazy, if I am unhealthy, if I am putting unhealthy things into my diet and into my habits, whether it be an addiction, whether it be a gluttonous type of engagement, if it be foolishness physically, where we put ourselves at unnecessary risk, these type of things, many ways outside of just sex, there can be a disrespect for our spouse if we've misused that which God has given us. And that's not the main point made here, but I think it's certainly applicable to this. So I want to share with you now some perspective from the Balswick book that can help you expound on his needs, her needs. Intentionally, those chapters are briefer, and therefore we do not have extensive amounts of reading, because I want you to work on some application. As I said before, I encourage you to do those questions at the end of the chapters of the Harley book, because that'll help you engage in the material better. So the bulk of what I'm about to tell you and lecture on is not found in the Harley book. It's in the Baldwick book, this one that I mentioned before. And therefore, pay attention, take good notes, and we'll go through this together. If you are interested in the book, if you already have the book, much of this comes out of chapter 6, where he talks about the intimate marriage. His phrase for, or their phrase for the fact that marriage really implies intimacy. And therefore, the marriage, not only a beneficial marriage, a loving marriage, a God honoring marriage, an enduring marriage, it needs to be an intimate marriage. On page 73, he says, they say, forgive me, habitual statement there. There is no such thing as instant intimacy. Intimacy is born out of trust and safety, an increasing scarcity in our world of suspicion and distrust. We read in 1 John 4:18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. However, while God's love is perfect, human love is imperfect. There's plenty of fear in human loving. In fact, most people find it quite terrifying to give themselves wholeheartedly to another, even in marriage. The dread of being rejected keeps people from the richest possibilities of intimate knowing. What the Baldwicks bring to our attention is that even in a very healthy marriage, or what could be a very healthy marriage, there can be a sense of distrust, maybe not even consciously. Now, let me think about some factors with you regarding that. Unfortunately, as we saw back in Genesis 3, sin is a reality in our world. And unfortunately, we far too often participate in various ways in sin in this world. And unfortunately, to the big topic, to remember two of the biggest topics in Scripture, sex and money, those areas are often touched by sin. And in regard to sin touching sex, we see that sex has been used in very harmful ways at times. And a great number of people have experienced some kind of sexual trauma, whether it's been physical trauma, whether it's been emotional trauma, whether it has been shame, whatever it may be, that is often brought into marriages. When that happens, and when the healing doesn't take place, and when the healthy vulnerability doesn't take place, there is somewhat of a lack of trust. It's just terrified of giving themselves wholeheartedly to another, particularly when someone has been hurt in some way. It's much more difficult to get back in that spot. We were talking about sports earlier. Think about the game of baseball, to switch analogies here. You think of a batter who's gone up to the plate, and every time they go up, the pitcher, for whatever reason, either has lack of control or is scared of their batting power. They just can't get beamed by the baseball. The batter does. And they may get to take a base, but man, it hurts. It hurts. And finally, it's like, I can't take this anymore. And the coach says, go up to bat. And in order to stay on the team, they may go up to bat. But they're going to step way back. They're going to do everything they can not to get hit by that ball, and will sacrifice their ability to hit well. Have that image in your head where somebody wants to stay in the marriage, so they get off the bench and go to the plate. But there can be a breakdown in trust because they know sometimes they get hurt when they trust the other person. And so they may still be engaged in the activity as the batter is with the pitcher. But they may say, well, I don't trust that person. And so therefore, even though I'm involved in the event, I am not fully involved. I may even pretend to be a part of this game, but mentally I'm checked out of this game. That's a vivid analogy of what is not the case in an intimate marriage. Intimate marriage is I'm enjoying this game. Let's play. The difference that analogy breaks down as baseball teams. One team's trying to beat the other, one be champion over the other. That is not. But you understand the idea that there's this living relationship that's beautiful and wonderful when couples trust one another. On page 75 in that chapter, the Boswick say the spouses choose to share because they want to be known and they're eager to listen out of a desire to know their spouse. You've heard the phrase, I'm sure, to know and to be known. That is a desire of all of us, whether it be on the friendship level. We just want friends, and we want to have people know who we are so we can feel significant. We also want to know others so we can have a healthy relationship. Well, yada, remember the word there we talked about back in Genesis 1:4. To know can also be a euphemism for sex. And so this idea of I want to know, I want to be known, I want to make love, I want to be made love to, this relationship that takes place that is healthy. And therefore, it is a desire that can be fed well and beautifully. It's also a desire that can be squashed and can be hurtful. They say later, predictable, faithful love is the basis for the capacity to be predictable and faithful in loving others. There's an interesting statement on page 78, quoting from a man named Thomas Oden. Thomas Oden defined intimacy as a mosaic. If you've been a while since you remember that word, think of art that is a montage. It's pieces of various things drawn together in this beautiful picture. That's really the idea of mosaic. It's not half a person stuck together. It's this beautiful blend. It says intimacy is a mosaic of two persons putting together moments of personal closeness that are unique to the two of them. The heart of Christian marriage is to form a relationship bond in which two are better than one, not just to become one, but two are better than one. We are better together. That is the framework by which marriage should be understood. They go on to talk about different types of intimacy, the commitment intimacy, emotional intimacy, sexual intimacy, and intellectual intimacy, creative intimacy, work intimacy, service intimacy, spiritual intimacy, conflict intimacy, and so forth. All these forms of intimacy. But on the topic of hand, sexual intimacy is not simply about sex. Again, going back to Harley, it is both the affection and the sex, and is done within an intimate relationship. It is beautiful. When we think about sexuality, it's important to know that it is a relationship meant to foster love, even a relationship that is to give us an indication of what it is to be loved by God. There's this creative way that the Bible talks about the Hebrew people, the Old Testament. We know them as the Jewish people, understood themselves to be, because God defined them as the bride, the bride of God, that he had uniquely chosen them and loved them covenantally. Then that same image is carried over in the New Testament, where Christ seems to be a little more, but keep in mind, God's not trying to be weird. God's not trying to be erotic in any way. But he uses that analogy to help us understand the closeness that in which we are to be with God, this total vulnerability for God. We hear the words of Scripture, Christ in me, the hope of glory, this beautiful intimacy. So again, it's not weird. Some of you may be in churches like the church where I pastor, where A lot of the style of music is contemporary, and so you have songs that are now considered old by my kids' generation, for example, but by some older generations would still be called contemporary or current. And a lot of these songs uh, are very intimate in nature. We think back to some of the old hymns um, where this image of walking with God and this physical contact with God, but it seems to be even more so in some of the more contemporary version songs. I have a friend that jokes about the fact sometimes you can't tell if a praise song is a man singing to a woman or to God. That's not coincidental, although sometimes it can be a little odd to think, well, am I really wanting to sing these words to God? There still is this beautiful understanding that God is our closest relationship. Now, if we have that understanding, we realize that a reflection of that can be our actual closest human relationship, and that is a relationship with our spouse. So there are multiple types of intimacy, but the sexual intimacy is the one that most closely uh, clarifies the way in which a couple comes together in complete vulnerability. On page 79 of the Baldwin book, it reads, emotional intimacy is inextricably related to sexual intimacy. Since chapter 12 is entirely devoted to this topic, we simply introduce the importance of sexual relationship to the broader intimacy principle. Next paragraph. The one flesh concept of Genesis is not merely a reference to genital connection, but to emotional connection as well. Couples have the best of both worlds by attending to both aspects of intimacy. Paul Ricoeur notes, quote, when eros, that's a Greek word for romantic love, think of the word erotic, when eros is mated with tenderness and fidelity, authentic happiness and spiritual fulfillment follow. If sex is the only emphasis and emotional and spiritual bonding is lacking, the couple ends up with a distorted intimacy. Spouses intuitively know something crucial is missing because sex alone just doesn't cut it. As a pastor, I meet with people regularly, and sometimes those meetings have to do with the issue of marriage. Several years ago, I was talking to an individual, and I had previously met with this individual and his wife, and their marriage was in a rough spot. And one of the issues had to do with the making love or sex. And for whatever reason, various reasons, that was not a healthy part of their marriage at the time. And one thing, going back to Paul's words about recognize our bodies are not our own and fulfilling the marital duty, he didn't mean that to be the 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 best. It was the bare minimum. In other words, you need to at least fulfill each other's needs. But that's not Paul saying that's as good as it gets. Well, in the relationship I was talking to, the person in the relationship we were talking about, duty to him, in essence, and therefore she was to give herself to her husband. But there wasn't a way in which it was basically told in that way that this is something I will do for you, even though I don't want to do that. I was talking to the husband about this, and the husband was saying that while certainly he physically would love to have that encounter with his wife regularly, it got to the point where he just felt wrong because it was all about himself. The pleasure part was all about himself, and he felt allowed but not welcomed. I think that is something that maybe not on that extreme, that when people would have that conversation much, but it's more common than we'd like to imagine that one or the other can read Paul's words and say, well, that's exactly where I am in the deal of human sexuality. What the Baldwins are pointed out is that can happen when the emotional and spiritual bonding are left out, when it all becomes about the physical. There's a great way for us to think about this idea of spiritual, emotional, and sexual intimacy when it comes to their book again. And the whole chapter talk about sexuality and its splendor, which I'll go back and talk about a few things about that earlier in the chapter. But in the latter part of that chapter, if you have the book, it's page 180. Monogamous lifelong marriage has always been the ideal context for sex. In marital sex, spousal vulnerability reflects God's self-giving grace. The marital relationship is a refining crucible of growth as well as a comforting container of trust. The two are protected by their covenant commitment and wrapped together in bodily trust. In the depths of the emotional and sexual intimacy, each spouse has a sense of well-being in the context of the mysterious one flesh union. That is a beautiful paragraph explaining why people of faith, particularly people of Christian faith, say that we believe that the Bible is teaching that the gift of sex is to be opened within the monogamous relationship of one man and woman, to use the old phrase in holy matrimony. The idea that it's a godly marriage, holy matrimony, is set apart, is holy. That's what that word means, to be set apart, unique marriage, holy union, the holy union that honors God. This class is called Understanding Christian Marriage. Without understanding this principle, we can't understand the view of Christian marriage. Monogamy, in the best meaning of the word, and the best living out of the word, is monogamy before and during. In other words, the act of sex, the act of sexual intimacy should be reserved for marriage, which is why we talk about no premarital sex. And then within sex, not only should it be a part of the marriage, it should be a healthy part of the marriage. So we talk about premarriage sex being sinful. We believe that because the Bible makes it clear that husbands and wives are to engage in that and not others. That's not simply to be stringent. That's not simply to say don't enjoy this pleasure. It's to help people realize this is made for something that is beautiful. And when used in the way, think of a firearm, think of a knife, think of dynamite, that if you use it carefully, can do amazing things. If you use it incorrectly, it can cause lots of damage. And unfortunately, as you're all aware, it's impacted all of us to some degree or another, whether it be ourselves or our family, whoever it may be. The trauma that comes out of misusing it can be very difficult. Particularly, we talk about within the marriage as well, which, going back to the text that you've been reading through, he says it's one of the most difficult things to overcome. A marriage that's been touched by the adulterous relationship, and that's because this powerful tool has been used incorrectly. You think how you have the power of dynamite, and you have deranged people trying to blow up things to harm people, and then you have the beautiful pieces of art. I think Stonehenge. These beautiful pieces of art where people say we formed these, we made these. We think of for example, the dynamite being used to have the faces of the presidents being formed into the face of the mountain. It's powerful. We also have people that are deranged, killing multiple people to the power of very similar devices. Sex can be the same way. It can be beautiful. It can create beautiful works of art, beautiful marriages, beautiful people, little girls, boys, the future. Sex can do this. Sex can also cause a great harm. So I want to read this paragraph by the Baldwins again. And you might want to even pause this and write it down, because it is a powerful statement, particularly if you work in church ministry and you want to teach the subject of marital faithfulness, or you're a parent and you want to teach children in your own home, the importance of this. You work with teenagers and you want to say, this is why we teach this, because some young people are saying, well, you're just trying to tell us not to have fun. All my friends are doing these things. Why can't I? Just because I go to church? It's not that. It's more complicated than that, but also more simple than that. In other words, there's a lot of complexity to explaining it, but the simple nature of it's a gift God has given that's beautiful, and if you use it well, it creates beautiful things. So here's the paragraph again. Monogamous, lifelong marriage has always been the ideal context for sex. In marital sex, spousal vulnerability reflects God's self-giving grace. The marital relationship is a refining crucible of growth as well as a comforting container of trust. The two are protected by their covenant commitment and wrapped together in bodily trust. In the depths of emotional and sexual intimacy, each spouse has a sense of well being in the context of the mysterious one flesh union. There's a beautiful paragraph talking about the lifelong sexual intimacy within a marriage that can be beautiful. A word perhaps for you, or a word that I encourage you to pass on to others. The misuse of sexuality, either by ourselves or by someone towards us, unfortunately, is a common thing. We don't want to present the idea that anybody who has been harmed by or anyone who has misused sexuality is beyond hope. God is a redeeming God. And so if there are things that you participated in by your own choice or things that have happened to you, no choice of your own, uh, don't allow shame uh, to overshadow such a beautiful thing. Um, I say often to my congregation that understand there is shame in the world and there are shameful things, uh, but shame does not come from God. What the scripture teaches is that God convicts. And there's a big difference between conviction and shame. Conviction is making one aware of things that are wrong or faulty or unnecessary, things that need to go. This is what God does to us. An analogy I talk about in friendship, I tell people that everybody needs at least one spinach and zipper friend. That person who's willing, as they're sitting across the table from you, say to you, you have spinach in your teeth. If you have a good friend, they're going to tell you that because they're going to push past the embarrassment of trying to point out something. They want to save you from the embarrassment of smiling broad for a camera next and having green stuck in the middle of your teeth. Um, that same person or different could be that zipper friend. You're about to get up and speak to someone. Or you're about to stand there for your wedding. Or you're about to go in for a job interview. Or you stand up to preach a sermon, and your zipper is down. Your friend's going to say, your zipper's down. That's a spinach and zipper friend. God, not to be disrespectful, but you get the image. God is the ultimate spinach and zipper friend. God is the one who says, that sin in your life, it's harming you. The thing in your life, that's unnecessary. The thing in your life, you'll be so much better without it. That's conviction. And conviction can feel painful. It can feel embarrassing. It can even hurt emotionally. But it's worth it because we become better at being the people God's created us to be. Shame, on the other hand, is someone saying to you, you are your mistake. Not only did you sin, but you are a sinner. Not only did you practice unfaithfulness, you are unfaithful. Not only did you do this one sin, but that is who you are. Shame is intended to push someone down and make them feel bad about themselves. And this is the tempter, the liar, who comes to steal and to kill and destroy, as scripture says. But God came to give life abundant and free. Satan loves nothing more than to cause people shame. And God does not stoop to that level, and God convicts. Now, sometimes it can feel initially the same thing, like the same thing, but it's not. It's not. It's so beautiful when God calls out that spinach, when God calls out that thing in our life that doesn't need to be there, and we're set free from it. When we say thank you for that conviction, it still may feel weird at first, embarrassing at first, but we're set free from it. Where shame is just a constant oppression, where we do not feel like we're allowed to even make that change. Like we have to leave that spinach. That we can't avoid it at all. And that's a painful lie that we must reject. The way in which all this comes together is in a way where we say, okay, God, I see that sin is in this world. And I see that even after sin is in this world, you still allow Adam and Eve to have a relationship that led to marital unity and to the birth of children. We also see this God inspired the young man and the young woman to write poetic literature to one another that we have in the Song of Songs, where it's even godly appropriately very erotic in nature. This erotic description the man has of the woman's body, the overwhelming awe that she has of his body and his presence, and the fact that they are enjoying each other. They're to use the analogy we talked about earlier, enjoying each other's fruit and enjoying the pleasures of each other. And then we see even all throughout the Hebrew faith and the Christian faith, there's this confusion of what do we do with the concept of sexuality. And Paul, not exactly sure when Jesus is coming back, says, well, I think personally it may be better to remain unmarried. But I tell you the truth, you can still serve God and be married. In fact, some of you need to do it because you're burning with passion. Go ahead and get married. And if you are married, here's what you do. If you're unmarried, stay unmarried, he would say at that time period. I'm not sure he'd say the same thing today. Um, that's for theologians to debate. But most people, most men and women, I believe, marriage is the way for them. Not all of them. If you're single and you want to remain that way, and then that may be the great decision for you. But most of us are married. And when we're married, we must use this gift that God has given us in a beautiful way. As Paul said in the passage to which I just referred, wives, your wives is not, your body does not belong to yourself alone. It belongs to your husband. Husbands, your body does not belong to yourself. It belongs to your wife. There's just mutual duty. But then the beauty of it, as we see in Song of Songs particularly, is that it's a beautiful thing to go past duty into enjoyment. And that's what we need to reflect upon this week as we think about this. Now, going back to the His Needs, Her Needs book, let us recall that the the way in which men and women arrive at this beautiful, vulnerable spot in marriage can be different. But just because there are two different paths doesn't mean there can't be a shared destination. So, wives, if you are a wife that relates to what Harley's talking about, and you feel like your number one need is intimacy, and that can be the holding of hands and the walking to the mall, holding hands and the hugs and the beautiful words and the flowers, then encourage your husband. Thank him when he does such things. Husbands, if you're a man like Harley says most of us are, and the one of the greatest needs you feel in your life is sexuality, is sex with your spouse. First of all, keep it with your spouse, but also be vulnerable, be open, and say this is something that is a high desire of mine, and have an honest conversation about it. Again, those questions in the chapters will help. But be patient, be gentle, be loving. The beautiful passage in Ephesians is a way in which we see this spelled out. I mentioned it earlier. Ephesians, Paul writes again, to a town where this topic is confusing, as is in most towns of the world today. Uh, there's this trying to outdo each other in the church and marriage and social life and everything. And that's why he comes down with this beautiful verse in chapter 5, which is often skipped over when we go into the next section, which is unfortunate. Paul says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. He goes on, the next verse, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. This is your act of worship. You can be worshiping your God by saying, husband, I love you and I'm here for you. Goes on to say, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Christ gave his life for the church. So husbands, going back to that verse, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. When you're loving your wife as Christ loved the church, you're submitting yourself to your wife for God's purpose and for your purpose, to say, I dearly care for you. And that is such a beautiful relationship. So you keep going down a few more verses, and Paul summarizes his point of submit to one another. Within that section, he goes on to talk about other social dynamics. Right there towards the end of that marriage section, he says, so husbands and wives, respect your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. If you're married, here's your homework, really, in addition to all the other stuff in the syllabus. Here's your homework. Your husband, love your wife. What's that mean? Go back to see previous verses. As Christ loved the church. Wives, your homework, respect your husband. One of the greatest ways you can submit to your husband out of reverence for the Lord is respecting your husband. Respect when you don't feel loved. Wives, husbands, love when you don't feel respected. And the more that those both happen, there's a mutual affection that grows and grows and grows, and the sexual life increases in beauty. And this is what God has designed it to do. I always like to say when I talk about the subject that there are times, again, maybe it's trauma in the past, maybe it's physical difficulties, mental blocks based on various reasons. My dad is a retired dentist. My father-in-law was as well. My granddad was as well. So our family knows teeth. If I have a toothache, go see a dentist. If I have an ache that is something that won't go away, I have something serious like a broken arm, I don't just deal with it. I go and see a doctor. I go to physical therapy, whatever it may need to be done. I tell you these things not to tell you about my medical history. What I'm telling you is somebody will feel like if there's something wrong sexually in a marriage, I can't talk to anybody about it. There's no difference than having a toothache and not going to the dentist, or having a broken arm and not going to the physician, than a person who is having sexual difficulties and doesn't go talk to somebody. Even your book that you've read talks about some resources where you can read or go talk to somebody about some any kind of sexual difficulties, whether it be emotional, mental, physical. So I encourage you, if that's an issue for you, then reach out and get help. Nothing to be embarrassed about. That's a very important part of marriage. So that's tonight's lecture. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope you're able to continue to stay up with the course. Again, as I began this lecture, I end this lecture with the invitation to contact me with any questions that you may have. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.